Mindcrime Liberty Show is Dotson in Japan. Today we discuss, was the COVID-19 regime failure a white pill or a black pill? Tim.
We started our show almost about 4 years ago in 2020 from this absurdity, which this absurdity, aka the war on COVID-19, formerly known as coronavirus, a lot of people on the right and libertarian right also had a dance with the regime. And not just a dance, an outright love affair with the regime. I mean, you get the regime COVID libertarians too. So it's not just, it wasn't just a perfect score. As Peter Hitchens likes to state, not everyone was a skeptic like I was, and us for that matter. We were skeptics from basically week one. I was at a Bible study recently, and one of the questions was, what is a verse or you like or think about? I didn't answer publicly, but the one I like is, but as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about, as it is this day, to save many people alive. So this is sort of like a, some people do things for evil, but the consequences in the long run are good, or good for overall, so to speak, or good for certain people. COVID-19 was a total regime failure. Think Taliban in Kabul dancing, think fall of Saigon, think something like, those would be the two sort of similar examples here. Think the war on drugs for that matter, too. Recently has come out that Fauci, even amidst the 6 feet, is BS. When will the vaccine be next? I mean, RFK Jr. has been on shows like Bill Maher. He's been on shows like, he even been on Reason Magazine. And Reason Magazine was atrocious on this. And he embarrassed Nick Gillespie and the other people in a pretty awkward interview. He was pretty good for himself. Again, I know RFK Jr. has lots of issues, so to speak, for other areas. But in this area, he was quite good. He wrote the book, The Real Fauci. And also, speaking of Jimmy Dore, Jimmy Dore is now like interviewing Alex Jones. Jimmy Dore started out on the Cenk Uygur show, Young Turks. Jimmy Dore actually went through the Google review process early on to be an official disinformation guy. Look this up. And he's actually vaccine injured, from my understanding. And he's a critic of all this stuff, too. He brings up immigration, how immigration in the third world. Same way with Max Blumenthal, he brings up the fact that the third world, only rich countries could do lockdowns because they just basically print money. Who's going to, where's in places like Guatemala or El Salvador or even China, where, how are you going to get the resources? You can't exactly work from home, or they don't have the same central bank privileges that certain Western states have. I bring up Blumenthal and Dore just because they're people who 4, 5, 6 years ago, everyone would say they're on the quote-unquote left. So what we see emerging is a left-right alliance on the COVID resistance front, and I view this as a very good thing. Now there's people who say that someone like Alex Jones is controlled opposition. For that matter, that could apply to a lot of different people that are people view as dissident. I would say it's a mistake to view them as controlled opposition. There's no difference. To say that there's no difference between him and CNN or like BBC. I think there's a clear difference. They're less controlled, I will say. And one of the persons who I think that Jeffrey Tucker, another person who has sort of redemption narrative for the libertarian side. And we did an episode, it was Jeffrey Tucker right about something. I forget the exact title we used. Is that Trump ran on draining the swamp and preventing wars and so forth. But he ended by giving Fauci and Birx basically a blank check to do anything that they want, more or less, while they publicly made fun of Trump, the Fauci, Birx, his health advisors, so to speak. And another person on the right who did poorly was Rod Dreher. Rod Dreher was someone who didn't let his kids play outside. I remember him saying that on the blog. I got a big fight on the comment section early on, where I just bring up Peter Hitchens. He said, look, I'm just repeating what Peter Hitchens says, and this is a fake manufactured crisis, and you're Mr. Benedictine option here, and you're falling for this. So a lot of people on the right went poor, or libertarian, or whatever you want to call this community. But what we're seeing is, now there's plenty of good people too that did Ron Paul, for example. So what we're seeing is a resistance axis forming of people, a sorting, so to speak, of people who fell for it and didn't fall for it. And the didn't fall for it are kind of going off into the deep end. Someone like Russell Brand, someone like Jimmy Dore, but also people like Tom Woods and others are even more skeptical of the regime in all sorts of areas, which previously they might not have been. So people are looking into all sorts of things. Again, there is so I'm going to set up an opposition here. There is the sense that the people who went along with it, some of them are doubling down, of course. Okay, so this would be the pessimistic narrative to counter me. As Whitney Webb would point out, no one point out no state agents or politicians have been jailed. Okay, no one's really felt any direct consequences who went along with this stuff. The problem is this is basically, short of losing a war, politicians and health agents are basically qualified immunity on steroids. So, I mean, if you're looking for some trial where Fauci's going to get jailed, that's not going to happen. So that is just sort of the nature of statism, so to speak, or reality or justice, so to speak. So a lot of these guys who went along with it, it just looks cringy, dystopian, and they try to distance themselves from this stuff. Stephen Colbert, a classic person in this sort of charade. From my understanding, his reviews, his ratings are down, as with a lot of the late night hosts, and a lot of the other, the other type regime comedians. No one really likes them. Again, so one of my cases here is that 4 years out, it seems like all the quote unquote cranks have been vindicated. There was no victory parade with Gavin Newsom, Stephen Colbert, and others showing how much lockdowns, masking, and jabs saved everyone. There's no I was a veteran of the war on COVID, I did so much good. There was none of that. Everyone's just distancing themselves from it. And this resistance axis now has exposed some of science too. And this can help resist the next thing, which is probably forced climate alarmist lockdowns, or forced veganism, or forced fossil fuel banning. So the methodology of criticizing science and criticizing interference in your personal lives on economic fronts like this, it's already set in motion. So some of the people have flipped. Dore and Brand to somewhat have it. And even Bill Maher, when he was interviewed by Candace Owens, at least he listened to Candace Owens bring up Alex Epstein and others the case. A few years ago, it might not be the otherwise. So my case is here is it seems like there's an optimist, there's a certain white pill, a certain optimism that could be read into this. Is this just a temporary victory, Swithin? Or is the black pill narrative still the better story? Yes, there's crushed businesses. Yes, people are dying. Yes, Birx and Fauci's and various companies have made billions. Lots of small businesses went out. The bigger deep state. There is a pessimistic narrative as hell. But maybe the optimistic narrative, or the white pill narrative, that's my starting point here. So then, what do you think of my case here? Thanks for doing this episode.
I think the whole debacle was clearly a big black pill insofar as what they were able to achieve quite easily, scaring the population, etc., ridiculously. I still see some people wear masks, although it's rare. But that's clearly a black pill. The question is, how many collateral benefits were there? I think is the interesting question. It does seem to be the case that very few people now are enthusiastically supporting lockdowns. What they will typically say now, rather than to say that, we saved so many lives with lockdowns, what they will say is, well, we did what we could at the time. It's better to be cautious. Yes, we know that this didn't really work that well. Oh, but it could have been so much worse. That's the style of argument you tend to get. Same thing with the vaccines is interesting. Very few people are going to go on record saying how brilliant it is, because it obviously isn't. And I think even the most sober defenders of the vaccine will say, well, we had some good. Yes, it's not really that long lasting, but it might save those people who are seriously at risk, yada, yada, yada. And so, yeah, it's kind of a good thing. But yeah, we probably did sort of oversell it. So you are right. No one is all in on everything they did was great. Not even the defenders. That said, there is a public inquiry presently in England, or the UK, on the government's handling of lockdown, which unsurprisingly, being an independent committee set up by the government, isn't really very independent, which has the almost seeming like preconceived goal to say, oh, well, the problem was we didn't lock down early enough or hard enough. So they're still going down that train. Because he had Carl Hannigan there, who was just basically ignored. And was his comment about the vaccine? It's like, oh, yes. Oh, no, well, lockdowns. Oh, you could have some benefits, but here's are all the costs. And then the judge who was doing it was like, but if there are benefits, surely we should do it. And he's clearly thinking, someone hasn't come across cost-benefit analysis before. So it's... So even here, although you could say that's a mainstream thing, it's still not being considered a bad in a strong or even mild. It's kind of considered a halfway house, I think, which is better than the way it was portrayed at the time. How much it will be portrayed like that in the future is another question, where it'll get better or worse. You are right, it has polarized people even more, and there are people, as you rightly point out, you could call it the dissident left, I think, who are much more concerned about state advancement of its power, etc. So you consider more like the traditional left. They have certainly come on side, and it's very much of a polarizing thing, and it has delegitimized the government in a number of people's minds. The big question is, though, even though it might have less popular support, does it have elite support? And there, I can't really think of anybody who wasn't wholeheartedly in favor of it. But that said, interestingly, you might have expected the oil industry to be very much against lockdown because it very much harmed oil prices, but they didn't seem to, which is interesting. I was listening recently to, what's the proper Marxist guy who disappeared for a time and then came back again, Caleb Maupin, saying that how he thought of the Rothschilds and the bank and the oil elite were in favor of around the world, basically, economically. And you would have expected the oil industry to oppose it because the oil price collapsed. Now, that said, maybe you could argue that was a way of getting rid of less competitive competition to weed out the market, maybe, just like that. But all my thought is, are the elite completely on side with it? Maybe they still seem to be. I mean, I think one of the most vocal critics was Elon Musk, but he hasn't really gone at them that hard. And he straddles an interesting position in sort of elites. Although, to what extent he is elite is another question, because Caleb Maupin and Keith Preston would say he isn't really. I think the focus really on them is groups of people rather than individuals, and these groups of people have much more power than any individual. And insofar as they have access to resources, I think Keith claimed at one point that Elon Musk was, or did he say someone else, that some Saudi oil guy helped him buy Twitter or something, which kind of makes a bit of a mockery of these sort of like individual net worth, richest man in the world competitions, as it were. So the elite question, I think, is an open one. I'm not sure on that. But certainly on the popular level, people have very much more have disliked it, and also some people who kind of went along with it in the first instance. I think if it was to be brought on again, it would have more organized resistance from the beginning, which might make it more difficult to be imposed. So it had some collateral benefits. This is one of the things I think is probably one of the major ones, although is I think crypto has done better from lockdown. I think in particular concerns about banking privacy, in particular the son of Fidel Castro in Canada seizing everybody's assets, I think has very much made people think, hang on, any of my assets could just be frozen at any time. Best to have them in a place where they can't be. So I do think crypto has done better now than it otherwise would have been. I'm sort of still not all in on crypto, but that very much seemed to me to be made me realize actually that's a really big selling point, is the privacy angle, especially considering the freezing of the assets. And ultimately that could end up being a problem with crypto, at least the central banks and stuff, because that's one reason why George Selgin, who is a fractional reserve free banker, doesn't like Bitcoin, because you can't easily do fractional reserve banking on it. That's why he's down on it. Although to what extent the financial elite think they can control it's another question, because recently the ETF came out. I think BlackRock has one and stuff. So whether Bitcoin and crypto will really be a thorn in the side of this establishment is another question. But it still does seem to be something that's been good that's come out of lockdown. So I think it's mixed. Oh, one other thing has been, well, that's not really a white pill as such. I think it's made some people's lives nicer insofar as it made working from home easier. And a lot of people had horrible commutes, and that seems to be on the way down. Now, granted, there could be more isolation being at home, but the fact that it has more of an option, I think, just on regular day-to-day life can make some people's life much more pleasant. So that'd be an overview of the fallout from the whole lockdowny stuff.
The word collateral benefits is a good phrase, pardon, because I think what I basically listed were the collateral benefits of this action, and most of and as far as the sort of regime defenders, so to speak, there's two things. They were doing everything they could do, or there's this sort of what I call this almost absolutist type reason where whatever they did was correct. And you can't criticize whatever the science or whatever the regime says is the case. And when the next crisis, if it does comes, the people who do that, I'd say it's going to take more propaganda. It's going to take more scaremongering to get more people into either into the camp of like obeying naturally or quickly, just because the way this one played out. So because this one is like World War One in analogy, the Great War, if there's going to be a repeat, they're going to have to be very scared. The elites who want to do this are going to have to be very scaremongering, and that's going to be a problem because it's going to be hard. I think never underestimate the deep state or these regimes, but it's going to have to be bigger. So there is a black pill narrative there, so that in the sense that they will have to go, and the they equals healthcare elites will have to go all the way, because they've tried to re-implement mask mandates here and there, but they so far have been generally defeated. Again, this is in the United States, this is in certain city hospitals and so forth. But so yes, some of them might creep back. Okay, but once they get mainstream, they get people so far have seemed to push back, and they become optional again. So is that the question I would say going forward here is, and this is mostly forward looking, is were the collateral benefits worth all the collateral costs? Yes, I would prefer if it never happened. Okay, I would prefer it never happened, and I would prefer if you could go back to 2019 and continue on without this fake crisis, so to speak, or this manufactured crisis. But since this manufactured crisis happens, how do we view it historically? And I think the only way to view it historically is to view it as a failure for the official position. And that I think libertarians and people who are dissidents need to think that way. There's an argument that's made that Chernobyl, for example, brought down the Soviet Union. That's an argument that I think it's Michael Malice himself in the White Pill makes, is that, or made that on Twitter, to speak, that Chernobyl, because it was a crisis that they handled poorly, at least seemingly poorly, um, they lost some sort of amount of the consent of the governed, so to speak. How do states and how do regimes? I don't think the United States or Britain is exceptional in that sense. How do states maintain their monopoly on power? Well, they do at some level need popular consent. The number of people, for example, not voting has 2020 was a bit of a high spot. But if you go around and ask people, are they voting? You get a huge amount of dissatisfied people who basically say they don't want to vote. They hate both parties. And, there's a good, Trump has his hands in all this stuff, so there's the case against Trump. Now, this is not a case for, like, I don't know, Chris Christie or Nikki Haley either. But there is a sort of a dissident, there is a case against Trump if that you can make that is very libertarian, very right-wing libertarian. Because that's another casualty of this. Trump went along with this stuff early on, and he still brags about being, the Operation Warp Speed and those things, which is one of the reasons why, as Jeffrey Tucker would point out, he's stayed away from the debates. Which goes back to the earlier period of the 2016 period. You could argue that's what brought the Donald down, because he was on pace to win the second term. He was on pace to win the second term here. And I would say another spillover of the collateral benefits is on other issues. There's been polarization and radicalization too. So Israel Palestine. I was a more or less neutral observer to the Israel-Palestine conflict up until we did an earlier episode on what ought to be done about Israel with Keith Preston, and I look back at that episode and I say, well, I'm remarkably mainstream in my views here, and there's been a movement away from that, and again, I think places like Ukraine, places like Israel, those issues, again, there's been more of a cross-pollination between the dissident left and the dissident right, especially on the online world, that, there's other areas where there's just more skepticism. So to think of historical failure, think of Vietnam. Vietnam basically destroyed all the goodwill that Korea and World War II, that the United States regime had. Because here we are, the richest country in the world is being defeated by people who are just digging holes and putting poles in there with AK-47s, picking off all these helicopters and so forth. And if you look at the war on COVID, wasn't asymmetrical warfare in the sense that the people resisting it had very little resources. Ron Paul, Jimmy Dore, you and I, and the people who during the war had everything at their disposal. And in places like Australia and Canada, they had like this sort of almost Orwellian levels of control. They could just go into the give, send, go, or whatever the thing and stake all their money. So this demonstration of the brute power, I think, has cynicized or a large amount of people. I don't think there's going to be some mass strike. So in this sense, I'm not a Marxist. As much as I listen to someone like Caleb Malpin or Chris Gatrone or various others, or for that matter, Keith Preston, I don't really think there's going to be some movement where everyone wakes up and overthrows, create some sort of paradise Earth. I don't think that. But I don't think. But my long-term optimism now is I don't think a dystopia will rule, and I think that the reason is because people like Dore and Brandt and Blumenthal can be flipped. That people like that can be flipped, and that I think is a benefit here. Yes, the people like Ron Paul were right all along. Yes, people like Peter Hitchens were right all along. But what's interesting to me is, rather than going along with it, I would say, it's about winning. It's about winning castles. This is Aaron McIntyre's argument. It's about winning castles, And on certain issues, I'd say the skeptic position has won a number of castles, a number of dissident institutions. And as far as elites are concerned, the growth of Russia and the Saudi Arabian axis, this is a Tom Luingo of Gold Goats and Guns podcast would point out, is that the growth of them, they didn't like the fact that oil prices went to $1, which is one of the reasons why they've made sure that oil hasn't gone below $4 US dollars a gallon. I think it's like 110. Whatever, the barrel rate is different. But Saudi Arabia has sort of broken away from the United States. The Biden regime is sort of pissed off that Saudi Arabia is not pumping more oil in the past few years. So the oil price. So that's another thing about, will the global elites, will the climate change win on the war on oil? So that's the next war, and I think there's reason to be optimistic that it can eventually. That oil won't the oil banners and the fossil fuel banners won't eventually win. Now, there could be a breakthrough technology, the micronuclear tech, micro battery tech, that actually people naturally go away from oil, or institutions and societies naturally go for oil. But there, I think there's reason to be optimistic. Those are my final comments here. This one may be a shorter episode, Swithin. But do you have any other further comments on, what about winning? I think Ron Paul was right. There's a number of people on the libertarian right that was right from the start. But my overview is that there were a number of people that started out as believers of the healthcare narrative, and now are questioning all sorts of things. So I view that as a win. If others want to stick to the sort of black pill narrative, they can. But I just say there's reason to be hopeful. Maybe that is misplaced optimism. Thanks for doing this.
I do think you're right. I mean, it certainly doesn't. I don't know of anybody who was opposed to lockdowns and anything, and then decided, "Oh no, actually, it was a good idea, and I was wrong." I don't come across anybody like that. But the opposite is true. So in that respect, in that respect, it's good. I would say also that you're right that it's going to be more difficult to impose a lockdown in the future. Unlike other forms of government action, it's so much directly reliant on compliance because there simply are not enough police to do so. And unless they were to put the fines really, really, really high, it's just going to be very, very difficult for them to enforce. Where if they didn't have enough, because compliance, it's not a critical mass number. I mean, I think they'd only need like 5 or 10% to oppose it, and it won't be enforceable because literally there's not enough police. I think the numbers who actually flouted the first time are probably under 1%. So obviously that's a lot higher. So I suppose that is good. When it comes to, you mentioned with respect to like democracy and people don't care about voting, I actually think that the coronavirus thing will be a pivot away from democracy, as I've mentioned it a few times before, a pivot away from democracy as the primary sort of justifying ideology of the regime, and it'll be going on to health. I think that's why everything is now a crisis and there's harm. So in the British government, I can't remember if they did this or not, with the online safety bill, wanted to ban things which will basically prevent access to things that are legal but harmful. Everything is harm. The UK something health and security agency put out saying, "Oh, there's going to be risks to life this week." Why? Because it was icy. It's January, and everything is portrayed in a way that the world is out, the world is against you, and you need to be protected. And who's the best to protect you? Government. That's how it's going. So I think that they don't particularly care as of yet. As I say, when that people are, there's more distance. I think they think, well, as long as the economy isn't too bad, the probability of much main resistance is not going to be there. And again, it's the elite angle. With respect to Chernobyl, well, I mean, one interpretation I came across, which I think it seems plausible with respect to the Soviet Union, was that what made the Soviet Union fall apart wasn't the fact there was a mass number of people who just decided they weren't going to acquiesce, but rather the people who were coming into the Politburo and the newer blood just lost faith in the Soviet system. And when they got critical mass of them saying this isn't working, the whole system collapsed, which I think is plausible. So I think taking a broadly top-down elite approach to things, if this has influenced the circulating elites to change, then that's going to definitely be a good thing. But as of yet, I'm not exactly sure that that's taken place. But certainly there are some collateral benefits. I will give credit to, well, first time I heard that term was from Sean Gabb. I believe in the context of his defense of the British Empire. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean or on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And recently, we broke 200 subscribers on YouTube, so that was good, whoever you were. I assume you weren't a Russian bot, or a bot from America, for that matter. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com.